When Michael and Diane Caldwell first stepped inside the stately brick mansion in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, they weren't just buying a house, they were buying history. The former home of the legendary Aretha Franklin had been on the market for years, changing hands a few times but never quite feeling lived in. The couple, originally from Chicago, had spent the last decade flipping historic properties. But this was different. This wasn't just real estate. This was the Queen of Soul's house. The estate itself was breathtaking 6,200 square feet of elegant rooms, vaulted ceilings, and a winding staircase that seemed to invite you into the home's past. The realtor, an overly enthusiastic woman in her mid-40s, recited the usual spiel. The custom-built features, the private balcony off the master suite, the sprawling backyard with a pool that hadn't been used in years. What she didn't mention, of course, was why no one seemed to stay in the house for long. Michael noticed it first. It was just after they signed the paperwork, standing in what had once been Aretha's music room. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the grand piano in the corner. He felt something, a weight in the air, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere. He brushed it off, blaming his own sense of reverence for the place. After all, they were standing where Franklin had likely composed some of her later works, maybe even entertained guests with impromptu performances. It wasn't until their first night in the house that Diane felt it too. They had barely finished unpacking when she woke up to the sound of music. Not the distant hum of a radio left on by mistake, but something richer, fuller. It was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate notes of a piano, filling the house as if someone were sitting in the music room at that very moment, playing softly in the dark. Michael wasn't in bed. Heart pounding, Diane got up, wrapping herself in a robe. She found him downstairs, standing motionless in the doorway of the music room. The piano lid was open. The keys moved. No one was sitting at the bench. Diane let out a sharp breath. The music was quiet, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was playing didn't want to disturb them too much. The melody was familiar. I never loved a man the way I love you. The couple stood frozen, listening as the notes carried through the empty house. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The keys rested in silence. The air felt lighter again, as if whatever had been there had left. Michael reached out, hesitantly closing the piano lid. Neither of them spoke as they walked back upstairs, but as Diane climbed into bed, she whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe it's just the house settling." Michael didn't answer. He wasn't sure if he believed that anymore. The next few days passed in a haze of half-unpacked boxes and quiet, stolen glances between Michael and Diane, both of them pretending they weren't waiting for something to happen again. The house had settled into a strange rhythm, as if it were breathing around them, exhaling its history into the spaces they now occupied. The walls held more than just echoes of music. They carried a presence, something unseen yet undeniably there. Diane spent the better part of the afternoon in the kitchen, unpacking dishes and organizing the deep cherrywood cabinets that stretched up toward the high ceiling. The space was warm and inviting, a place where someone, perhaps the Queen of Soul herself, had once stood in the same spot, cooking, laughing, living. The countertops still held faint marks, the kind left behind by years of use, where something hot had once rested just a little too long. As Diane arranged the glassware, a noise interrupted the quiet, a faint humming, soft, melodic, rising from somewhere beyond the hallway. She froze. It was a woman's voice, smooth, rich, filled with the kind of depth that only comes from experience. The melody drifted in the air, weightless yet deeply rooted in something old, something powerful. Diane turned her head slowly toward the doorway. Nothing. The hallway beyond was still, bathed in the gentle glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the large arched windows. She held her breath, waiting. The humming stopped. The silence was somehow heavier than the sound had been. She exhaled, shaking off the eerie sensation crawling up her spine. She told herself she had imagined it, that it was nothing more than her own thoughts filling the space, the way an empty house could sometimes trick the mind into hearing things. But later that night, when she stood at the vanity in the master bathroom, brushing her hair in slow, even strokes, she heard it again. Soft, lingering, almost affectionate. She turned sharply, gripping the wooden handle of the brush tighter than necessary. The room behind her was empty, and yet, the large mirror reflected something she hadn't expected. A faint smudge, barely noticeable, on the fogged-up glass near the bottom corner, as if someone had stood close, their breath warming the surface. Diane's pulse quickened. She reached forward hesitantly, pressing her fingertips to the cool glass, tracing the spot where the condensation had formed. It was warm. She turned off the bathroom light and climbed into bed beside Michael, careful not to wake him. Sleep did not come easily. The house, it seemed, did not want to be ignored. Michael had been skeptical at first, rational, logical. But reason had a way of unraveling in the quiet hours of the night. It was past midnight when he heard it. A soft rustling. Not outside, not the wind brushing against the windows, but inside, somewhere in the vast corridors of the house. He sat up slowly, his breath steady, his senses sharp. Diane was asleep beside him, her breathing deep and even. He listened. A shuffle. A creak. The sound of careful, deliberate movement. Michael swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet pressing against the cool hardwood. The hallway outside their bedroom stretched long and dark, the dim glow from the wall sconces barely illuminating the path. The noise came from downstairs. He descended slowly, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. The living room sprawled out before him, silent and undisturbed. The grand piano sat where it always had, its polished surface reflecting the faintest glimmer of light from the chandelier above. But something was off. The air smelled different. A hint of perfume, light, floral, undeniably feminine. He walked toward the piano, heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out, fingertips grazing the smooth lid. A breath, close, near his ear, warm. He spun around, pulse thundering in his ears, but there was no one there. Only the lingering scent of perfume. Only the faintest impression of something unseen, standing in the space between moments. Michael exhaled shakily and turned back to the piano. The lid was open. It had been closed when he came downstairs. He was sure of it. A single key pressed down, slow and deliberate, the note ringing out in the silence. Then another, and the melody began again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Michael didn't move. He hardly breathed. The piano played on, each note striking the air with impossible precision, forming a melody too deliberate to be random. The soft, ghostly arrangement of a natural woman seeped into the house, filling every shadowed corner with something unseen yet undeniably present. The music swayed like a whisper, lingering in the air before dissolving into silence. The moment the last note faded, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, like a current of air had passed through the room, rearranging the energy. Michael reached for the piano lid again, this time pressing down gently, feeling the weight of it close under his palm. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to steady his breath. Then he felt it, the warmth, not from the air vents or the house settling, but something close, something near, the distinct sensation of a presence just behind him. He turned. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement just outside his peripheral vision. A flutter of fabric, the way a dress might brush against the floor as someone walked past. But when he looked, the room was empty. He stepped away from the piano, moving toward the staircase, but his body was rigid, every muscle coiled tight with the urge to run. He forced himself not to, forced himself to climb the stairs slowly, feeling the cool wood beneath his bare feet, the silence stretching unbearably thin around him. At the top of the stairs, the master bedroom door was slightly ajar. He was certain he had left it closed. Inside, Diane lay curled beneath the blankets, undisturbed. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the walls. Michael slipped into bed beside her, his body stiff, his mind racing. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Diane found him at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. His eyes were shadowed, his expression distant. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Michael didn't answer right away. He stared at the dark liquid in his mug, watching the way it rippled slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. Finally, he nodded. Diane exhaled slowly, setting her own coffee down. "We need to talk about this." Michael lifted his gaze to hers. "There's something in this house." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Diane hesitated, then said, "It's her, isn't it?" Neither of them wanted to say her name. Not yet. Not out loud. Over the next few days, the presence made itself known in small, unmistakable ways. The humming returned soft, thoughtful, weaving through the house in the quiet hours of the afternoon. A lingering warmth near the piano, as if someone had just been sitting there, fingertips grazing the keys. The perfume, a delicate, floral scent that neither Michael nor Diane owned, drifting through the hallways at unexpected moments. And then there were the objects. Diane was the first to notice. She had been in the master bedroom, unpacking the last of their moving boxes, when she found an old, leather-bound notebook resting on the vanity table. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. With careful hands, she picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the slight give of the worn pages. The cover was unmarked, but when she opened it, she found neat, elegant handwriting stretching across the yellowed paper. Lyrics, unfinished. A song that had never been recorded. She traced the ink with her fingertips, reading the words slowly, the melody forming in her mind as if the notes had always been there, waiting to be heard. Her breath caught in her throat. Had this belonged to Aretha? Had she sat here, in this very spot, pen in hand, pouring her soul into these pages? Diane turned the notebook over, searching for an explanation, anything to make sense of it. But before she could process what she was holding, she heard it again. The humming. It was closer this time, right behind her. She turned sharply, and for the first time she saw it. A figure, faint but unmistakable, standing near the bedroom doorway. The outline of a woman, graceful, poised, watching. The air shimmered around her, as if light itself bent in her presence, casting a soft, golden glow. And though Diane couldn't see her face clearly, she knew. She knew. The Queen of Soul had never left. The house, it seemed, wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. There were no cold spots, no violent disturbances, no malevolent shadows lurking in the dark. Instead, it was as if the walls themselves carried a memory so strong, so deeply woven into the fabric of the place, that it refused to fade. Aretha was still here, in the music, in the warmth, in the quiet moments when the air felt just a little heavier, as if someone else was in the room, listening. Michael and Diane didn't speak of leaving. Not yet. They had come to own a piece of history, and history, it seemed, was not ready to let them go. Diane spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at the vanity, the notebook resting on her lap, its pages slightly curled at the edges as if from years of being handled. The lyrics, unfinished lines scrawled in steady, deliberate handwriting, felt like a secret whispered across time. She traced the ink with her fingertips, feeling the weight of it, the presence of something beyond mere history. It was personal, intimate, a moment captured in writing yet never fully realized. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken. She turned to look at the doorway where she had seen the figure. It was empty now. The house was silent, but the feeling hadn't left. She could almost hear the music, a melody not yet born, waiting to be completed. Downstairs, Michael had taken to pacing the length of the living room, his hands tucked into his pockets, his mind restless. He had always been a practical man, grounded, skeptical of things that couldn't be measured or explained. But what was happening in this house defied logic, and no amount of rational thinking could dismiss the truth settling into his bones. Something was here, not just a memory, not just the weight of history, something alive in its own way. The presence in the house wasn't intrusive. It wasn't malicious. If anything, it felt like a quiet observation, a lingering attachment that refused to let go. Michael turned his gaze toward the grand piano. It sat motionless in the corner of the room, its polished surface catching the last slants of evening light. He thought about the night before the music, the sensation of breath on his neck, the scent of perfume that had no earthly source. Had Aretha really left something of herself behind? Was she still here, in the quiet moments between songs, in the warmth that filled the house when the sun dipped below the horizon? He exhaled slowly. Then, without fully understanding why, he moved toward the piano and sat down on the bench. His fingers hesitated over the keys. He wasn't a musician. He had never played a note in his life. But something in him, some instinct, some pull urged him to press down. The first note rang out, filling the empty space. It was soft, low, a single sound that seemed to vibrate through the house, as if waking something up. Michael pressed another key, then another, a slow, tentative attempt at forming a melody. And then, the air shifted. A warmth curled around him, gentle and steady, like the presence of someone standing just behind his shoulder. He felt it before he heard it. The humming, soft, encouraging. Michael swallowed, his fingers hovering over the keys. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It wasn't drifting through the hallways like an echo. It was right here, close, next to him. His breath caught in his throat. He turned his head slightly, his pulse hammering, his skin prickling with awareness. But there was no one there. Only the feeling, only the music, only the quiet knowledge that he wasn't alone. He lifted his hands from the keys and sat still, listening. The humming grew softer, then faded completely, leaving only the hush of the house settling into the night. Michael let out a slow, unsteady breath. Then he stood and walked upstairs, where Diane was still sitting at the vanity, the notebook open on her lap. She looked up when he entered the room, and in the quiet, heavy pause between them, neither of them had to say a word. They both knew. The house wasn't just a house, and Aretha Franklin wasn't finished yet. The days stretched into weeks, and the house settled into a rhythm, as if adjusting to its new occupants. Or perhaps, Michael and Diane were the ones adjusting to the subtle hum in the walls, the faint perfume that drifted through the halls, the occasional weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. They had stopped questioning it, stopped trying to explain what couldn't be explained. Instead, they began to listen. Diane spent more time with the notebook, tracing the ink, reading and rereading the words left behind. The lyrics were incomplete verses that ended abruptly, thoughts unfinished, a melody without a resolution. She thought about Aretha sitting at a piano, pen in hand, working through the song in her mind. She imagined the pauses, the deep inhale before pressing forward, the moments when inspiration flickered just out of reach. And she imagined what it must have felt like to leave something unfinished. To feel that something, some small, vital part of yourself was still waiting to be completed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep blues and purples, Diane sat at the vanity, the notebook open in front of her. She pressed the tip of a pen against the paper, hesitating. Then, in slow, careful strokes, she began to write. At first, the words came hesitantly, as if pulled from the air itself, piecing together a melody she could almost hear. The rhythm felt natural, like something half-remembered, something whispered just beneath the surface of waking thought. And then, the humming, soft, close, a presence, warm and steady, standing just over her shoulder. Diane didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened, allowing the sound to guide her hand. The notes formed in her mind, the lyrics flowing as if they had always been waiting to be written. A final verse, a closing line, the missing piece. The song was whole. She exhaled slowly, setting the pen down, her hands trembling slightly. The air in the room was warm, alive, charged with something she couldn't name. She turned the page back and read the lyrics from the beginning, the words falling into place like they had always belonged. And then, a breeze, gentle, lingering, not from the open window, not from the air conditioning, something else, a presence lifting, retreating, fading into the quiet. Diane sat still, waiting, listening. But the house was silent, for the first time in weeks, truly silent. And in that silence, she felt it. The weight was gone. The air was clear. The house finally was at peace. That night, Michael and Diane sat together in the living room, the grand piano gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. The house no longer felt heavy with something unseen. The presence that had lingered in the corners, in the pauses between moments, had faded. Not vanished, not erased, but settled, as if something unfinished had finally been completed. Michael reached for Diane's hand, his fingers warm against hers. "You finished it, didn't you?" he asked. She nodded. They sat in the quiet, listening to the stillness. No humming, no shifting air, no unseen breath against the back of the neck. Only the warmth of a home that had finally let go. Diane exhaled, a slow, steady breath, then smiled softly. Somewhere, wherever she was, Aretha Franklin was singing again. And this time, the song was complete. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.